So thank you everyone for joining us this morning, this evening, today to discuss the work of the Geneva Association on cyber terrorism and cyber war, as well as the general issues raised by malicious cyber activity. I want to start off by introducing each of the speakers, then I will get to some housekeeping matters. Each of us speakers will then have a short presentation, and then at the end of this seminar there will be plenty of time for a question and answer session. So just to introduce each of the speakers, so I'll introduce firstly Cyrus Dalarami. Cyrus has been at Munich Re for more than 15 years, and he's currently leading the Munich Re Cyber Direct team for corporate clients, and his focus is predominantly on the European markets. Prior to this, Cyrus was leading a cyber insurance unit within Munich Re's corporate underwriting division. And he was responsible for Munich Re cyber strategy, the underwriting process, including underwriting guidelines and other legal aspects, as well as cyber risk assessment process. So we're very excited to have Cyrus with us today. The second speaker that I would like to introduce is Kaya Siglik. So Kaya is a senior director in digital diplomacy at Microsoft, where she's worked for nearly a decade. She leads Microsoft's work on digital peace, focusing on encouraging international peace and stability online. Previously, she's worked on Microsoft's international cybersecurity policy. Before joining Microsoft, Kaya led the APCO Worldwide's technology practice in Seattle and worked as a director of APCO's Worldwide Brussels office. She holds degrees in international relations and histories and in European politics from the London School of Economics. So again, another exciting speaker. The third speaker I'd like to introduce you to is Chuck Jainchill. So Chuck currently works in as the cyber product development leader. So within this role, he is responsible for overseeing the development of new cyber products and coverages across AIG's commercial and consumer insurance business in the US and around the world. He is a leader in developing AIG's cyber edge policy language and frequently assists in negotiating coverage for the most complex cyber accounts. Prior to his current position, Mr. Jainchill served as a vice president and division counsel for the professional liability division of AIG Financial Lines, where he was lead lawyer supporting AIG's professional liability, media and cyber insurance products. Mr. Jainchill received a law degree from Brooklyn Law School and a Bachelor of Engineering in Electrical Engineering from Carnegie Mellon University. So again, welcome Chuck to today's presentation. And last but not least, I would like to introduce Christian Wells. So Christian is a lawyer who was a partner with Hogan Lovells for 26 years and more recently was general counsel at Pool Re. In private practice, he specialized in the operation of insurance business such as mutuals and Lloyd's syndicates in bespoke contracts of insurance and reinsurance. Christian joins us as an IFTRIP representative, and he was also very instrumental in helping to shape the first paper on common language. So thank you very much to all of our speakers for joining us today. So next slide, please. So we'll just, move to the next slide. In terms of the agenda today, I will be going through the key findings of the Geneva Association's 2 reports on common language and on attribution. Christian will be outlining hostile cyber activity and what value add that adds to the industry or provides for the industry. Chuck will then talk about cyber insurance and attribution. Cirrus will move on to broader discussion, particularly from a reinsurance perspective about cyber terrorism and cyber war. And last but not least, Kaja will speak about international norms. Next slide, please. So just a slight housekeeping matter. In essence, there are two ways in which you can raise a question. The first is that you can do so verbally by raising your hand. At the bottom of the screen, you will see the raise hand icon. Or the second way that you can do this is by typing your question into the question box. Please feel free to do this at any point in the webinar, and we hope to address your question during the question and answer. If we don't get onto the question, feel free to email me after the webinar and I can respond to it in due course. So without any further delay, I would now like to begin today's presentation. Next slide, please. Think back to last year. The start of the global pandemic, the spread of COVID-19 was an acute reminder that the globalized world became connected to the point where an obscure biological virus from a single source rapidly triggered economic and cultural disruption around the world. This is something that has not been witnessed since the Second World War. During the time where the physical virus of COVID-19 was gaining strength in terms of the numbers of infected people, in the cyber arena, the FBI reported a 300% increase in cyber incidents alone, and that was only within the first months of the pandemic. The challenge was thus laid out for the insurance industry. Next slide, please. To better understand collectively what risks we faced and the probable future risks arising from cyber terrorism, hostile cyber activity, and cyber war, and what knowledge we as an industry needed to be equipped with in order to be able to make informed decisions about underwriting and ensure that coverages for these risks was and continues to be fit for purpose, and that the market continues to grow sustainably. In looking at all of these issues, the challenge for insuring cyber terrorism and hostile cyber activity depended on the insurance industry's ability to do the following 5 things. 1, accurately and clearly articulate the risks and any parameters or limits on coverage to stakeholders. 2, identify the responsible actor or type of actor. So for example, terrorist, state actor, criminal, etc. 3, discern the type of attack and whether it was cyber terrorism, hostile cyber activity, or cyber war. 4, assess the impact of probable events. And 5, determine what solutions are available at an industry level to provide cover, and then within each firm to determine what the appropriate limits are and any corresponding terms and conditions of cover. Today, I will focus on the first 3 objectives, which center on clarity of coverage and being able to attribute and characterize events. Once the industry is able to understand very clearly who is responsible, what the type of attack is, it will then be possible to provide answers, clarity and certainty about the ultimate coverage, who will be held and who will be made accountable. Within this context, just a little bit of background on the work that the Geneva Association has done. The Geneva Association arose to the challenge in 2019 when it was determined to provide thought leadership to the industry on cyber terrorism and cyber war. It partnered with IFTRIP, the International Forum of Terrorism Reinsurance Pools, and it developed what has been now called the Geneva Association and IFTRIP Cyber Terrorism and Cyber War Task Force. The task force involved approximately 50 preeminent cyber leaders from the primary insurance and reinsurance pool space. The task force produced or has been tasked with producing 3 reports. Report 1 was published in July 2020, and it was towards a common language to promote insurability. The second report was Mapping a Path to Cyber Attribution Consensus, and this was published in March of this year. And the third report, which is due to be published in the summer of 2021, was around impact, quantification, and solutions. In his presentation, through the Geneva Association's new terminology, hostile cyber activity, as a potential tool for the insurance industry to mitigate any potential ambiguity in terminology. Briefly, the term hostile cyber activity sits between existing notions of cyber terrorism and cyber war, as understood within the insurance context. The intent is to cause serious damage in or to another state, regardless of the publicity of causing terror. As such, it is not merely cyber terrorism. Even though it tends to be perpetrated by or on behalf of or with the financial or moral support or encouragement of nation states, hostile cyber activity cannot be classed as an act of war as war is currently defined. On that basis, the term might help to distinguish between what is insurable and what is not, and war at this stage is not insurable in any cyber insurance contracts. The next question which we have for the insurance industry, once we clarified which language was used, is to look further at the process of categorization of events. So that was the process of attribution and characterization. The process is important as it determines issues such as responsibility and accountability. And yet the processes are complex and convoluted. To explain the processes further, attribution is a process of allocating responsibility for a cyber attack to be connected to a cyber actor, and in doing so, in many cases, allocating the correct or ultimate responsibility to this state. Although the process of attribution and characterization are two separate procedures, the process of attribution plays a large role in characterizing an event as war, cyber terrorism, hostile cyber activity, or merely cybercrime. The process of attribution and characterization are critically important in determining cyber policy wordings, whereby through the process of attribution and characterization, it will be possible to determine if there are any operable sublimits in standard commercial insurance contracts and what amount of cover should be paid out by the insurer, and if relevant, if any amount of the claim will also be paid by a government-backed terrorism pool if it operates and if it provides coverage. Attribution can also help the potential breach of sanctions law by determining who money definitively cannot be paid to or who it's illegal to pay certain amounts of money to. Next slide, please. A useful starting point where it's possible to do so is to, if an act looks like cyber war, to see firstly if it is cyber war. The reason why is that in almost all insurance policies, there is a universal exclusion of war and therefore cyber war. War in the insurance context is defined quite narrowly. So it's based on the either war as in a declaration of war as per the Geneva Convention, or behavior engaged in within a broader setting of a warlike environment. Given that this is quite a narrow band of activity, very little cyber activity, unless it is part of a existing war, would be categorized as cyber war. The challenge associated with attribution is not just a challenge in terms of concerning the attack itself and who was responsible and who should be accountable. The challenge is also more political, as a party who's seeking to attribute or characterize may have reasons why they wish not to do so. And these reasons might be broader and unrelated to anyone that was affected by the cyber attack. For example, because of existing political or economic ties which attribution may affect. As you will see, the paper has proposed a clear framework, one which may be used as a, I suppose, as a roadmap or a process for attribution and characterization. The precondition to this is that in order for cyber attribution to be considered, there must at minimum be a suspicion that a malicious actor was involved, something which would suggest at the outset that more than a mere cyber criminal or more than mere cyber criminality is involved. The first question is thus whether the act was one of cyber terrorism, cyber war, or hostile cyber activity. Although this seems like a somewhat straightforward question, in almost no cases will the answer be straightforward. It will then be necessary to have a close analysis of all evidence which is available, including technical aspects and available material from police and intelligence services. Often during the initial phase, the process of attribution and characterization will be done secretly with information that cannot be made available within the public domain. Given this is the case, the findings generally will not be publicly known, but it will help to inform who are involved in the process regarding where they need to go next in terms of finding relevant information. The next phase is often known as in-house attribution, and it will be done to determine who the actor was, cyber criminal, cyber terrorist, or hostile actor. The process of characterization will then be determined. A second round of attribution and characterization may need to be done if, for example, the outcome is going to be tested by court or within a court. The reason being is that the information will then need to be within the public domain. Next slide, please. In terms of the attribution and characterization process, I won't dwell on this any further because both Chuck and Cyrus will be detailing it much more in their own presentations. So briefly, in the interest of time, I now want to touch on I suppose the closing part of the second report, which is the potential to develop international norms. So the Geneva Association found in our research that ideally it would be advantageous to create greater consensus and consistency internationally in terms of the process of attribution and characterization. However, reality dictates that although this is possible and although this is desirable, it's only likely to be achievable in the medium to longer term. The work of IFTRIP and the Geneva Association highlighted, however, that we could start to work together to start to build building blocks which could be the basis for future development of norms. One way in which this could, for example, work is through a pilot or a case study within one locality. And for the states that agree to the terms of the norm, it may then be possible to create harmonization and thus national bubbles where the norm operates effectively. I won't speak about this any further, as I know Kaya will speak later on about how further international norms may be developed and implemented. I now would move the floor to Christian Wells, who will speak to you about hostile cyber activity. Christian.
Thank you, Rachel. The top story in my newspaper on Friday was West condemns malign Russia, in this case for the SolarWinds hack of the US government. State-executed and state-sponsored cyber attacks are a growing threat. Russia is far from being their only exponent. One reason for this state of affairs is language or terminology. Language inevitably tends to move behind the times, but in this area it has an additional problem in the shape of a deeply entrenched set of meanings and definitions which are almost impossible to adapt to the cyber age. Thus, state-executed and state-sponsored cyber attacks do not fit the current legal or dictionary definitions or concepts of terrorism or war. Indeed, not being war, with all its consequences, may well be a major reason for their popularity. but then we need a new label for such attacks, one which will allow them to be discussed by interested groups such as the insurance industry. In approaching a label, it was important to the Geneva Association and IFTRIP task force for it to be clear enough on the one hand, without being overly prescriptive and potentially anti-competitive on the other. We regarded hostile cyber activity as a phrase as meeting that requirement. Hostile connotes the warlike act, cyber the medium, and activity the breadth of types of attack and targets. Furthermore, we regarded hostile cyber activity as not requiring a suite of subsidiary words and phrases to permit it to be discussed by the insurance industry, although we were ready to create a suite if necessary. When the task force approached the subject and looked at the current spectrum of cyber activity, we concluded that there was a substantial grey area between cyber terrorism, of which there has been thankfully little so far, and cyber war. Now, when I use the phrase cyber terrorism or cyber war, I mean those activities in the strict sense of terrorism or war being carried out by cyber means. Next slide, please. We regard hostile cyber activity as falling directly into that grey area. Although there will inevitably be questions at the margin of precisely what the nature of an attack is, it is clear that there is a need for insurance to protect private businesses against the impact of destruction or disruption caused both directly and as collateral damage by what is in effect interstate hostility. As the slide suggests, hostile cyber activity may well not be intended to cause terror, and it is almost certainly intended not to bring about war. It is intended by one state, whether that state perpetrates it directly or not, to inflict economic, infrastructure, or moral damage on another state, whether by damaging public property, such as hospitals or railways, or by damaging major commercial interests in that state or clearly associated with it. In addition, given the nature of hostile cyber activity and the often careless way in which it is perpetrated, collateral damage is an entirely likely concomitant. So there is a major exposure to be covered. The challenge of providing insurance for it is not to be underestimated, particularly given the history of efforts to develop full-scale cyber cover. But the need is there and will only grow. Next slide. Given the scale of hostile cyber activity, both as regards the number of incidents and the extent of loss, we regard it as likely that some government involvement will be essential if the full potential level of direct and collateral damage are to be covered. Many of the terrorism pools around the world may offer cover against hostile cyber activity unwittingly at present. They offer blanket cover under definitions of terrorism which may be wide enough to cover hostile cyber activity if the original insurance covers it, and we know only too well that there is still plenty of silent cyber cover in existence. Pool Re is one of the few terrorism pools to offer cyber terrorism cover in positive language, but its definition of terrorism is relatively restricted and state activity is excluded altogether. So with hostile cyber activity, the insurance industry will largely be starting from scratch in seeking government support. It will be necessary for everyone in the chain of protection, insured, insurer, reinsurer, retrocessionaire, and perhaps government, to bear the greatest load they can financially before passing the risk on. But if that is done on a national scale, hostile cyber activity should be insurable. Moreover, the development of the cover would be a major success for the insurance industry. But that's quite enough from me. I look forward to your questions. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you very much, Christian, for your useful insights into hostile cyber activity. Now I'd like to move the floor to Chuck Janeshill.
Thank you, Rachel. You can go on to the next slide. I'm going to try to talk about a few issues here and bring together a few different points, maybe to kind of bring together some of the different things we talked about. When the Geneva Association and IFTRIP brought together the cyberterrorism and cyber warfare task force, we quickly recognized that we are looking at cyber terrorism from two different perspectives. And there's the I'll call it the cyber insurance perspective, and then for lack of a better term, the traditional property and casualty perspective. And again, just to say what cyber insurance is, it's the term used to describe the insurance products developed most of the last 20 to 25 years to address the new exposures arising out of breaches in network security and failures of data privacy. The standalone cyber products almost exclusively address financial exposures, both third-party exposures, lawsuits, and regulatory actions, and first-party losses, expenses, and business income arising out of cyber events. They don't generally cover the physical aspects, the property damage, bodily injury, and deaths that might be covered under a property or casualty product. And from the inception of the product, cyber insurance, like these other lines of insurance, property and casualty, included a war exclusion. And the war exclusion that recognizes that some types of events just could not be insured. So just to take a little bit, going back a little bit to the history, again, of cyber terrorism in the cyber insurance space, again, the non-physical, it was recognized as cyber insurance developed that there were lots of different types of actors that might perpetrate malicious cyber activity against an organization. There were disgruntled employees who wanted to steal corporate secrets or sabotage computer systems. There were just the mischievous actors, the hackers, that the war games type hackers that wanted to invade systems just to see what they could get, or to amuse themselves by implanting code, or in competition with other hackers, or for other reasons that varied. And of course, there were criminals who were looking to either steal information, particularly personally identifiable information, other personal information, but also corporate information for financial gain. A question was raised in the markets about what cyber insurance, or how the cyber insurance market would respond, where the attack was not for criminal or mischievous or disgruntled reasons, but for social or ideological, religious, political reasons, and whether the war exclusion, which didn't address that directly, what would be the view of this this new cyber market to that kind of threat, and that kind of threat of individuals causing or threatening harm using cyber was what the cyber insurance market was calling cyber terrorism. And over time, it became clear that the market's answer was no, we're not trying to exclude that the growing cyber insurance market could cover this brand of quote unquote cyber terrorism, but war was not an insurable event. And again, with apologies to those from the traditional property and casualty markets, and people, I can be corrected, but to look at it from the other side, the property and casualty markets had historically excluded war long before cyber was a word that any of us talked about or cyber insurance existed. As the terrorism threat grew and was recognized that the threat of terrorism could not be easily underwritten, insurance policies began to exclude terrorism losses. If markets found solutions for this, as Christian talked about, and there were pools, particularly in Europe, such as Pool Re, and in the United States after 9/11, the development of the backstop mechanism of TRIA, where the government would come in and act as a last resort reinsurer for large terrorism risks. When the topic of cyber terrorism arose in these more traditional markets that insured physical risk, the concern was that terrorists would now use cyber means to cause property damage, bodily injury, and death, and for example, if a hacker could contaminate a water supply or cause a train to derail from thousands of miles away by using a computer, how should that be treated? And I think, again, Christian touched on that briefly. So, but they were, well, let me phrase it this way. The traditional physical insurance market began asking, how does cyber terrorism change the underwriting and insurability of terrorism, while the cyber insurance market was concerned how cyber terrorism might affect the underwriting of cyber risks that we're already covering. So I think that difference became very clear, that the way you're looking at it, the way the two different sides or two different insurance markets were looking at cyber. And I think the distinction is very important. Cyber insurance was coming from a view that said that cyber events are insurable, and cyber terrorism is just one aspect of that, to say it a different way. And traditional property and casualty markets were recognizing that insuring terrorism was problematic, and cyber terrorism was similarly problematic or even worse. And to the extent there were solutions developed to insuring terrorism, the question was, were those solutions appropriate or sufficient for insuring cyber terrorism? So this was important because I think, again, the first conversations we had, we began to realize that the cyber insurance market was covering what we called cyber terrorism. I come from the cyber insurance markets, while property and casualty was saying somewhat the opposite, or not the opposite, but that terrorism was a serious problem, and cyber terrorism was a kind of an offshoot of that. So that was the first point. Attribution. Why is attribution important in cyber insurance? And again, things that Rachel pointed to. But first is the war exclusion. That's the kind of the center of what we're talking about. And since war is generally defined as a state of conflict between two nation states, and possibly between two groups within a nation state fighting for control, most war exclusions go a little further than that. I think that'll be talked about later a little bit. In the traditional war scenarios, the parties generally know who's attacking them. It's evident where the bombs are coming from, where the planes are coming from, where the soldiers are coming from. And in cyber, it's not always as clear who the attacker is. And if we cannot be certain that it's a nation state is ultimately responsible, can we call it war? But I wanted to touch on one other thing, again, that Rachel brought up, that cyber attribution has become an important question in connection with a current issue confronting cyber insurance more directly right now, and that is ransomware and sanctions. In October 2020, the Office of Foreign Asset Control in the United States Department of Treasury, or OFAC, issued an advisory on the potential risks associated with insurance companies and others facilitating ransomware payments to actors who may be sanctioned, have a sanction nexus. A company, including insurance companies and law firms and others, that facilitate payments, including ransom payments to sanctioned persons or entities, could face civil or criminal penalties, just as the actual payer does. And this is not just hypothetical. And just to give a little bit, one example, that last summer, a strain of ransomware known as Wasted Locker was linked by several cybersecurity sources to an actor calling itself Evil Corp. And Evil Corp, due to earlier exploits, as well as its leaders, have been designated sanctioned persons by OFAC. So as a result, insurance companies are now faced with considering the evidence that these cybersecurity sources and others are bringing, and whether Wasted Locker, the evidence linking Wasted Locker to Evil Corp is sufficient, and whether they can legally reimburse a ransom payment. And just to be clear, the Council of the European Union has similarly imposed sanctions on individuals and groups that may be connected to cyber attacks and ransom demands. So that's another way that attribution is important. But again, returning to the attribution question, we recognize that even if you can attribute a hostile act to a nation state, it does not always end the inquiry. Just to give, again, a couple of examples, back, I guess, I'm not sure exactly, I don't have my date here, but 4, 5, 6 years ago, when North Korea is understood to have attacked Sony Corporation or Sony Pictures, and in response to them releasing or planning to release a film that they found offensive, some people called what North Korea did cyber warfare, And the ultimate attribution to North Korea is basically agreed to maybe whoever the actors were, but that's generally not considered war. It was not an attack on a country, on one country on another, an attack, on a company for something the company was doing. Is that cyber terrorism, however? And again, I think under our cyber policies, with the financial losses and the losses sustained by Sony War Financial, that would be what it is. The last thing I'll just bring up and leave others for later for questions is cyber espionage, such as SolarWinds and the other attacks attributed to the Chinese and others. These again are acts by nation state, and sometimes they've been called acts of war, but espionage in the time of peace is generally not considered war. So again, this is the idea that they're nation state attacks. They're not, the nation state determination or attribution is not the final determination of whether the war exclusion is triggered. I'll leave that there for now, and we can discuss some more during question and answer. Rachel.
Thank you very much, Chuck, for your insight. Now I'd like to move to Cyrus Dalarami, who will provide us with an overview on cyber terrorism and cyber war, and also an important reinsurance perspective on these issues as well. Cyrus.
Sure. Thank you very much, Rachel, Christian, and Chuck. Maybe already next slide, please. So to not repeat too much of what has already been said, let me just bring it to a level where the problem is from a reinsurance perspective. So what we don't like, and that's the second bullet in the middle, is the level of ambiguity that is out there. And we don't like it for two main reasons. The first reason is that we don't put the client in an unpleasant situation of not knowing exactly what he's covered for and what is not. And the same is true for the carrier. So may this be the primary or the reinsurance carrier. We don't like any ambiguity as well because of the potential impact on the balance sheets, and mostly for reasons of accumulation. So there's huge accumulation potential in the cyberspace, generally speaking. And I've already seen a question related to that. I can be more concrete later on. But that's exactly the kind of events where we need to have clarity as to whether or not they are covered or not. So I think the question was related to the escalation of attacks principle. So basically retaliatory action between two different nations or even more, leading to a size of an event that is aggregated and which is basically too big to be insured at some point. That's maybe something I can come back to later. So far, we haven't seen any industry alignment, both in terms of the risk appetite, but also in terms of the wordings that are out there so far. So I think the work that has been done within the Geneva Association is certainly helping to define better clarity, and basically gives us as the industry some hints as to how we can approach this problem. And better differentiate between those things that are covered and those that are properly excluded, and that you can at some point call cyber war. The problem about the definition is that in the cyber context, you don't really know what war actually means. So I think we do have to approach it from a different perspective and basically describe indirectly what we actually mean, and how we would then, as a consequence, properly exclude it. When it comes to the exclusion, certainly attribution is a challenging factor. We've said that a couple of times already today, and everything that is helping in order to be more precise when it comes to the process of attribution is absolutely necessary, and brings us as insurers, as carriers, into a better position based on the fact that we can actually better calculate with loss scenarios that may be out there. When it comes to cyber terrorism, Chuck pointed out exactly why this is covered and what the evolution to covering this was. The problem about tries to basically write it back as part of terrorism exclusions is bringing in some issues. So for instance, if you're covering or if you're writing back cyber terrorism in a way that you promote state-sponsored terrorism, it's not really something that we can support because of the fact that at the end of the day, can you really distinguish between a nation state action in the sense of war and state-sponsored terrorism, which could actually be exactly the same, especially when courts are ruling in that direction. And again, that should be avoided. So again, ambiguity is absolutely critical, and that's a summary on this slide. So again, how can we overcome this issue? Next slide, please. And I think we definitely have to prevent situations where we have to cover uncontrollable accumulation. So we clearly have to define those scenarios that we can cover and others that we have to properly exclude. So everything that goes beyond insurability, it needs to be crystal clear. And I've put some criteria on this slide that I personally believe are most instrumental in looking at and defining when it comes to writing such an exclusion language. The first point, conventional war. That's something that you typically see in traditional war exclusions, and there's actually a kind of a consensus in the industry that this kind of event needs to be excluded. So we are in the physical war situation. We probably have destructive loss scenarios, so property damage, bodily injury and death. And on top of that, you may have additional cyber attacks that are just being used as another means, as another weapon, basically, which is adding up to the already existing war situation. But, and I think there we are absolutely clear as well, and I actually appreciate the work that will be done as per your explanation, Rachel, on the quantification aspect and the fact that there will be loss accumulation events that go beyond the pure destructive events, but will have a pure disruptive nature. So you will have purely financial losses, and those kind of losses will accumulate in a way that they have to be excluded. And we call them detrimental impact events. So there will be severe disruption of essential services. There will be a catastrophic state in the very nation that is being attacked, and you will actually see this. And in essence, if something is becoming so big that it's actually putting that state into a catastrophic situation, so where critical infrastructure is down, where essential services are down, you as an insurance industry can also not cover this. So as a consequence, this kind of impact needs to be excluded. And quite honestly speaking, with these two dimensions, we could have already stopped here. So this would be the ideal situation, to just say, well, conventional war is excluded, and everything that is becoming so big that it's basically putting the nation in a catastrophic state needs to be excluded. But, and that's also kind of a consensus, we are talking war or cyber war, and war has always this connotation of a nation state origin. So attribution is key as well. And that's why this topic also needs to be addressed. But in essence, it's putting us insurers in an awkward situation, because if you say you want to exclude everything that is so big that it needs to be excluded, if you put the attribution aspect as another element in your exclusion clause, then in essence you have a double trigger. And that's why, again, it's absolutely essential to properly define what we mean by attribution, to better create evidence as to when something can be attributed and where we have better clarity as to what that really means. And yeah, again, better norms, better clarity in terms of the process will help us in order to tackle that challenge. The fourth point on the slide has already been mentioned as well, the collateral damage. And it's also related to the question, let's say you have two nations attacking each other, and you have a kind of a widespread event where the worm is basically spreading out of the attacked area that was the original geography that should have been hit. What are you doing with the collateral damage out there, and how can we make sure that these collateral damages are adequately addressed? That's something we have to address in the wordings accordingly. Next slide, please. So everything that we are doing is geared towards having better clarity, and this will have positive effects on the carriers, but also the insureds. So they need to know what they are covered for and what is excluded. We have to find solutions around collateral damage. We have to find solutions around attribution. And as a consequence, at some point, whenever something is becoming so big that we cannot insure it, we have to talk about state involvement, so governmental backstops, pool solutions, and everything that makes sure that nations that are being attacked are aware of the problem. And we can go into detail later on in the discussion round, because there's a lot of interesting aspects related to that. Thank you, Rachel. I think we can go on with Kaya now.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Cyrus. And last but not least, Kaya, I would like to introduce you to talk about international norms, and I guess in particular, given that you're from Microsoft, I think it would also be great if you can, I suppose, show how insurance is part of the broader piece as well, and how we can collaborate with other industries such as yourself. Kaya.
Sure, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for organizing this. I think this is an incredibly important conversation, so I'm really glad we're starting this cross-industry conversation in this space. Microsoft has been a part of the cyber warfare, cyber norms, attribution debate for a good 10, almost 15 years now. I think we've been the first ones who've been very actively noticing, and maybe we can go to the next slide, the uptake in nation states attacks and offensive actions in this space. The slide that's on the screen is basically just a subsection of the suspect nation state attacks that we've seen over the past decade. And obviously there's trajectories clearly in the one direction. And we've seen a substantial amount over the past year. The SolarWinds, SolarGate attacks that happened at the end of last year, and that attribution of it happened last week. And Microsoft Exchange hack, again, associated with a nation state, were simply two of the latest ones that kind of came to the light and featured prominently in the media. There's a lot of attacks that sort of are much smaller level, that do not necessarily impact governments as much, but target individuals, target journalists, but at the same time expose the industry to greater vulnerabilities. So we've been looking at this with a level of concern. Obviously, the tech industry is oftentimes not just the tool of warfare, but in this case also a victim, as well as the basically the ground where the field of war, I will say. So with that in mind, we started this engaging with international organizations, with states, to try and then sort of get to a common minimum baseline of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable behavior in cyberspace. If we go to the next slide. The main rationale behind it is, my colleagues just earlier now talked about the different examples of how the insurance industry is coming to sort of together around common definitions. The same has to happen for states. It has to happen for state-associated sort of entities, both from a deterrence, resilience, as well as a sort of offensive action perspective. And we've gone some way to get there, but we're still a fair amount away. This is still a very new field, and particularly as international law has typically evolved, it takes centuries. And so the speed at which both technologies evolve and as with which the industry is demanding action to be taken is often unusual for the discussions that happen in the international level. The slide here has 5. There's more, but I feel 5 of the main, most important discussions that have been happening in this space. The one at the right bottom corner focuses on cybercrime. There's emerging discussions that will kickstart most likely in May this year, but a potential global convention on cybercrime. This is something that's been sponsored by the Russian Federation, we've been looking at it with a fair amount of concern. So it does not necessarily target nation state activity, but looks to curb cybercrime, which of course is important, but is sort of almost besides the point. And in a lot of the Western democracies have adopted a Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, which is a Council of Europe convention that has, I think, close to 70 states that have adopted, including the US. I think New Zealand's on its way, several countries in Latin America, several countries in Africa. So it's as far as we have gotten in terms of a global convention in this space. So we worry a little bit that this could be replaced and derailed by a new effort that might take decades at the UN. The other discussions that we've been following fairly closely and that have yielded some important results were the UN group of governmental experts, the GGE, on advancing responsible state behavior in cyberspace in the context of information security. All of these have very long names. This is a process that's been going on since 2004 and had 6, I think, iterations, some of them successful and some of them not. The GGE brings together a subset of countries within the UN. It is a government-to-government discussion only. The current iteration is about to end also in May, and includes 25 states. The states that participate at balance. You have a balanced number from Europe, a balanced number from South America, and proportionally so on, plus the Security Council members. And this group has in 2015 issued a sort of probably the seminal, I will say, agreement on what are some of the rules of behavior in this space that need to be adopted, implemented, and promoted. The 11 norms of responsible state behavior that look at things like protecting critical infrastructure, making sure you don't attack critical infrastructure, protecting certs, emergency response units effectively on the internet, and so on. It also asserted that the international law applies to cyberspace. Didn't say how, but it does apply. The how is obviously something that needs to still be debated, but in its entirety, including human rights, including the international humanitarian law, particularly relevant when it comes to the issues of cyber war, so not peace, as well as the UN Charter. And the reason why I called out the IHL in particular is as one of the gentlemen that talked before me also mentioned that a lot of this activity does not rise to the threshold of war. In fact, most of it does not. So a lot of this is clearly something that happens in sort of in our everyday. Following to that, 2 years ago, the Russians sponsored and opened a working group on developments of in the field of ICT in the context of information security. This just published a report a month ago, even less than a month ago, calling, and we'll restart in 2 months, but bringing together all of the General Assembly to agree that international law applies, but also reaffirming the 11 norms, as well as putting some clarifications into the text. For example, in particularly in the light of the last year, calling out healthcare as specifically needing to be off limits and deserving special protections, as well as supply chain security, particularly important in light of SolarWinds. And there's another discussion that will kickstart probably in the fall, which is a program of action. It's just a French-sponsored initiative that we would particularly like to support, as it for the first time establishes a permanent body of discussion and also looks to concretely involve multi-stakeholder community, so industry and civil society in the discussions. So it's not just governments talking to governments, which we think would be particularly helpful in this space. The only other thing that I will call out, and because I know we're running out of time, is the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, which is currently the largest multi-stakeholder cybersecurity agreement. Again, over 70 states, close to 80, signed it. Over 1,000 other entities from industry and civil society, aligning governments and other stakeholders around 9 principles, all looking to clarify what is acceptable and not acceptable behavior in cyberspace. And this is something where we've been really enthusiastic about it and observing it, participating, encouraging others to participate for some time, as it provides a great opportunity to actually work together, cross-industry, cross-groups, on providing guidelines, a little bit like you were all discussing for in the insurance sector particularly, but sort of bringing in other stakeholders. So for example, just last week, Microsoft, the Alliance for Democracies and the Government of Canada issued a paper that focuses in great detail, and was developed through a series of workshops under the Paris Call on, what you need to do to implement election security principles, because one of the principles in the Paris Call focuses on, not interfering in electoral processes. So there's a lot of opportunity that the Paris Call gives to drive new initiatives and sort of cement their implementation and wide acceptance. I'll stop here. I'm sure there'll be questions, and hopefully this was a helpful tour of the international community.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kaya. And thank you to all of our four panelists. So just to remind everyone that's still tuned in, there are 2 different ways to ask questions. So you can type them into the question box, or alternatively, you can raise your hand and one of the events or communications team will unmute you so you can ask your question. In the interim, we've got a couple of questions that have come through. The first one I'll start with was a question from Jemima Hall. So Jemima is from Gallagher's. So her question is, in regard to attribution, do we need government buy-in? For example, consistent attribution, categorization between private and public in the face of politics or optics? And if so, how do we go about this? On this question, I'll start with Christian, given that you're representing IFTRIP.
You're muted, Christian.
I've been muted and I haven't unmuted myself. Forgive me, thank you. Government involvement undoubtedly helps with attribution in the sense of providing an answer. It doesn't necessarily provide a wholly accurate answer, even where you have an agreed process. A lot of the international pools, or sorry, a lot of the national pools around the world don't actually have formal processes. They merely have contacts with their governments. In the case of Pool Re, we have a formal process for the certification of an event, but it's a bit like a black box. We submit a request for certification to the government, and the government will then issue a certification that something is or is not, and in the case of Pool Re, it is or is not an act of terrorism. So there may be a number of factors at play on whether a government certifies something as terrorism or as hostile cyber activity or otherwise. It's an easier approach, not necessarily a fail-safe one.
You're muted also, Rachel.
Sorry, now I was on mute. So Chuck, over to you from the primary insurance perspective.
Right. I mean, I think obviously the best case scenario is having some sort of governmental or international way of certifying or determining attribution. But as with all things in insurance policies, I think that the attribution may have to be determined legally in court, and then the standard, well, in the United States, I think in most places for civil litigation might be something like preponderance of the evidence. And even though a state may not be willing to take the position that an adversary or a friend was the perpetrator of an event, in court, the standards of having expert testimony and a variety of sources, I think. So I guess, again, I think attribution, having government buy-in is best, having public-private partnership to get to this result. But in the absence of that, or if in the void of that, the insurance industry has to do what it'll have to do to determine where things fall on the spectrum.
Thanks, Chuck. So, Kaya, I'll move to you now with the, I guess, non-insurance perspective. You've been involved with governments previously in terms of attribution. How do you think that they should be involved? And in terms of, I suppose, a different industry looking into the insurance industry, do you think that there is effective partnership?
So I think in reality, the attribution, and has been sort of referenced to, the attribution tends to be, especially a public attribution, tends to be a political process. Right? As governments call out other governments for malicious activity, there's more at play than a specific activity. But that means that the government role is essential. I will also say there's oftentimes we don't necessarily, as the public, hear about it, and attributions are made behind closed doors, which is unhelpful for the purposes of this conversation, but it might be able, it might become, it is a part of a political and international relations game, and might actually help the situation improve. But I will say from the tech industry perspective, Microsoft and others tend to call out specific groups rather than necessarily governments on their actions. The groups themselves might operate from a particular location, and we are able to call that out. But the sort of the link between the sort of state and the particular group is difficult to establish. That's difficult to establish, in normal international law. If you look at just at sort of the cases we've seen in front of the International Court of Justice in former Yugoslavia, but even more difficult in cyberspace. So that is the link that tends to be missing if industry does it itself, and that's where the government action, in particularly with their signals intelligence, is something that we call on and rely on, and we've also, for instance, that I will probably encourage everybody to take a look at the SolarWinds attribution that was just made last week by the United States, not just because it was fairly timely, it was fairly close to the event itself, but also because of the detail that was published, both in terms of technical detail as well as sort of the normative law detail. This, I think, one of the first ones that we've seen as comprehensive. So I think things like that we would encourage, and it would improve, I think, the situation for all of us.
Thank you, Kaya. So now I'm going to pose a different question. So this is from Sander. So the question is, how do you cope with escalating nature of small attacks to evolve to larger scale events, and even can evolve to war? And how do you manage the interactive nature of hostilities, action and reaction? And to start this off, I'll move to Cyrus. And I know you briefly started to mention this in your presentation, but I think this would lead nicely into the question that's being asked. Cyrus.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, because that's exactly the job we have to do as an industry. And of course, we've done internal analysis, other markets have done this. And again, the third paper is dealing with this. So basically, I think we better have to define what kind of accumulation risks we deem to be insurable. There are certain categories that we all acknowledge are covered. So mass malware up to a certain size can be covered based on the risk appetite that we have. Other events would include like a mass outage of a cloud system. So that's typically things that would be covered under cyber policies. But there are other, I would call them uninsurable, or events that go beyond insurability. That would be events like infrastructure failure, so an outage of a power provider, for instance, and this to avoid kind of the contingent losses that customers of this power provider would actually face. And then there are the kind of war events, and those events still need to be defined in more detail. But according to our understanding, the kind of, you call them escalating events, where you have a back and forth shooting between different nations, and basically, retaliatory action, if you want. These kind of events also may go into a direction where they exceed a certain threshold, and where, as a consequence, they would have to be called war, and where you would have to exclude them. And I think that's why it's essential to focus on this kind of impact-based approach by emphasizing the scale of the event and not so much the semantics or the definition aspects. And the escalating event is certainly one of the examples that we would definitely exclude. There's a topic, of course, in terms of the timing aspects, because let's say you have a smaller event and that is escalating over many months or even years. And at some point it has reached the threshold. So you may be in a situation where you as an insurance company have already paid this out to a certain extent. And then you would have, and this is kind of an awkward situation, you would have to recollect the money, which is not possible simply. And that's why we have to talk about it beforehand and define more concretely if these kind of events are covered or not, again, in order to avoid these situations. I hope this answered a little bit the question.
Thank you, Cyrus. So in the interest of time, I'll move to the next question. So the next question we have is from Irfan Mohammed, and he asks, do you think the industry can address this challenge without active collaboration with national security or intelligence agencies and what is currently being discussed and or pursued. And I'll open that to the panel in general.
Rachel, could I, Christian, say a few words?
Absolutely, yes.
I think it's unlikely that the insurance industry will get worthwhile direct contact with security services, just by the nature of the way they act. I think they're unlikely to reveal much in the way of useful information. If you want the information that the security services provide to governments, you will have to have government involvement, and even then you will only get it through a fairly thick filter, and you will get it in the form of some sort of government certification. So you will get security service input, but you won't necessarily know that that's what it is, nor will you necessarily know whether it's determinative of the government's certification or other decision. So it's a difficult question, really difficult balance. If you go to court, as Chuck was referring to earlier as the alternative approach, then the court will do its best with the evidence available, but that evidence may not be conclusive. Certainly there may not be enough evidence of state involvement or state execution to allow the court to determine that there has been hostile cyber activity.
Thank you, Christian. So just to add to that, from the GA's perspective, is we have, where possible, reached out to different security and or intelligence agencies to help us with our own research, and we very much encourage that continues to be the case as and when is appropriate, and as and when those agencies are able to share information with us. So if any of you are from that field, again, we would love to speak to you to help inform our own research and sort of move it forward with the security and or intelligence aspect to the extent possible. I'm going now to move to the last question. We have about 3 minutes left, so if those in the panel can answer this quite quickly. So the question's from Christian Thiman, and the question is, what are the panel's thoughts on how to define damage in a cyber attack and how to define compensation? So Kaya, Chuck, or Cyrus?
Well, I can let them follow up, but I'd quickly say that that is problematic, given what I had mentioned earlier, that you know, what Christian and Pulri would look at is often more of the physical nature of what terrorism has always been considered, and what the cyber insurance industry has looked at is generally the financial damages, which are the largest portion, or often the business interruption losses, and the measuring of that, which is another. I can spend hours on that on the insurance side. That how to measure business interruption from a cyber event is maybe even more difficult than how to measure business interruption from a physical event. So I don't know if I have an answer to that, what the damages are, how much the ransom is, you know, what the ransom is, but there is a lot of uncertainty.
Thank you, Chuck. Cyrus?
Yeah, maybe as a summary, there are disruptive and destructive events, and destructive events are more referring to the to the pool solutions, and the disruptive ones, they are the ones in the cyberspace. And I would from a business interruption perspective, we may even call them non-damage business interruption events that are definitely going into a devastating effect. They may be causing damages that go way beyond everything that can be imagined. It is pretty similar to what we see under the pandemics. It's non-damage BI losses as well. And that's the ones that we would deem to be insurable and critical from an affirmative cyber perspective. Let's put it like this.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Cyrus. So that brings us to a close for today. So thank you very much to all of our panelists, to Christian, Kaya, Chuck, and Cirrus, to everyone who's tuned in throughout the presentation. Just to end off, if each of the panelists can just say one point that they want the audience to go away with today, and then we'll end. Thank you. Christian?
This is a great opportunity for the insurance industry. We need to do a lot of further work, but it's a real opportunity for the insurance industry to make a difference at a time when it's often under fire and its reputation is under threat. There could be a good news story here. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Kaya?
I would say this is really, it's an opportunity both for the insurance industry. I think I would agree with that, but I think it's an opportunity also for cross-industry collaboration. So to work not just within the insurance industry, but more broadly with the tech and even with governments, as we are discussing, and more broadly, because I think that's the only way we can actually make a substantial impact and make sure that, you know, the damage is not necessarily just to particular companies, but it's to the trust and to the trust of the ecosystem as a whole, and that's immeasurable, right? But so if we want to kind of preserve this part of our economies, our lives, I think it's important that we work together to try and resolve this.
Thanks, Kaya. Chuck?
Thanks. I think what we find from this and a lot of other topics is that cyber, well, this ties back to other insurance products that have been around for 100 years or more, that cyber insurance brings unique perspectives or requires unique perspectives on the way we're looking at these problems of terrorism and warfare and of many other things. One thing that wasn't brought up before is you know, when talking about cooperation with governments, is that cyber is international, that it's going across borders. It doesn't know the difference. It doesn't, you know, discriminate where, you know, Great Britain ends and Europe starts, or where the United States is, or anything else. So the need for international cooperation is probably larger here than other areas of insurance.
Thanks, Chuck. Cirrus?
Yeah, so let's have a look at the current pandemic and the fact that ambiguity also there has led to some loss situations that the insurance industry didn't like. Let's focus on more clarity when it comes to attribution, when it comes to the processes of characterization as well. And let's work together. And most likely, I think, and I'm repeating myself, it makes sense to emphasize on the impact, on the potential size of the event, together with the concepts that we've demonstrated today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cirrus, and thank you again to all of our panelists and to all of our audience. I just want to emphasize again that any of the findings that the Geneva Association has drafted or has found, they can be downloaded in the form of report 1 and 2 from the Geneva Association website. Both of those reports on common language and attribution are currently available. The third report will be available in the summer. If you're able to, could you please fill out the short pop-up survey after you leave the session today? And thank you very much.